Hello, everyone. This is the 71st episode of the Soccernostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles, and I am joined by Paul from Shipley in England. We are pleased to have Irish freelance writer, historian, and broadcaster, Mr. John O'Carroll, once again on our podcast. For this episode, we continue our interview series with Mr. John O'Carroll as we discuss the matches of the Republic of Ireland national team during the 1986-87 season. Welcome back.
Thank you very much, Shahan. Always a pleasure and a privilege to be on your podcast. Continuing to enjoy the podcast immensely. And of course, a big thank you to you and of course to Paul as well in that regard.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you take us back to the fall of 1986 and the state of the Republic of Ireland national team with the first full season of Jackie Charlton at the helm?
Yes, indeed, Shahan. Well, as you rightly pointed out, the 1986-87 season was really going to be the litmus test of Jack Charlton's international managerial credentials as regards managing the Republic of Ireland, because the qualification campaign for Euro 88 was about to begin. The Republic were in an extremely tough group with Belgium, Bulgaria, Scotland and Luxembourg. And of course, Belgium, Bulgaria and Scotland all had taken part in the 1986 World Cup in Mexico. And in those days, as you know, it was only one team to qualify from each group. So qualification was going to be a tall order, to put it mildly. Now, of course, Jack Charlton had taken over in March 1986. And by the time the autumn of 86 came around, he had been a few games into the job. So he was slowly, I suppose, implementing his style of play and beginning to recruit players that would espouse and who would be compatible with the style of play that Jack wanted the Irish team to play. Now, I have to say as well at this point, now just, to give a quick summation of the Jack Charlton era, although I know now we'll be probably doing this in a much future podcast, but Jack Charlton took over in 86, stayed until the winter of 1995, as we all know. But we have to point out as well that in many ways, the Charlton era in charge of the Republic, he was very much at the time the right man in the right place, because he took us from being something of a nearly team to a team that was qualifying regularly for major tournaments and major championships. Now, having said that, there has been, I feel, a degree of exaggeration and overstatement as well in what he achieved with the Republic. Certainly, he sort of got the Republic over the finishing line, as it were, as regards qualifying for major tournaments and doing reasonably well in these tournaments. But we have to remember as well that a foundation was already in place by the time Jack took over. And I suppose credit for that foundation must go to three former holders of the manager's position of the Republic of Ireland, namely Owen Hand, John Giles and Liam Toohey. A foundation, as I say, was in place. Jack Charlton came in, applied his own style of football. As I say, took us from being nearly men and underachievers into a consistent international team. But I suppose you could say as well in some respects that the style of football we did play under him was quite limited. As I said to you in previous podcasts, many Republic of Ireland soccer supporters only started following the team from Euro 88 onwards. And because of that, there has been a mistaken belief that Jack Charlton and Jack alone was responsible for the success of the Irish international team, when in actual fact, the foundations had been put in place sometime prior to that.
At this point in time, was there still a lot of talk about the discarding of David O'Leary?
Well, not so much at the time, because they'll only become evident as the 86-87 season progresses. We have to bear in mind that kind of at this point in time, in the fall of 86, or approaching the first game against Belgium, Jack had only a couple of friendly games and a friendly international tournament in Iceland under his belt as manager. So, I mean, he was still running the rule over players. And I suppose, in many ways assessing his options and also assessing the standard of the domestic league in the Republic of Ireland. So there wasn't too much noise at the time. It really only became apparent as time went on, David O'Leary's exclusion. But I recall mentioning in a previous podcast, in many ways, David O'Leary became an unwitting scapegoat for his exclusion because centre half was one area at the time where the Republic of Ireland were well served. I mean, you had Mick McCarthy, you had Kevin Moran. I know in England the surname is pronounced Moran, but the actual correct pronunciation is actually Moran. You also had Mark Lanson, who could play centre back if required. And of course, Paul McGrath could play centre back if required. So Ireland were well served in the centre half department. So I suppose in many ways, you could say Jack Charlton took the easy way out in scapegoating David O'Leary for, as it turned out, 2.5 years. But where inconsistency came into that was that, as we know, David O'Leary was excluded because he turned down the opportunity to play in the end-of-season tournament in Iceland in May of 1986. Jack's inconsistency, setting down a marker, came into play was that the Liverpool contingent of players, namely Mark Lanson, Ronnie Whelan and Jim Bacon, they all missed the Icelandic tournament as well. They opted to, I suppose, not to take part because they had a long season with Liverpool. And yes, once September came around, the Liverpool contingent were included in Jack Charlton's matchday squads. So there was a little bit of consistency there. But apparently there was a background story to that, in August of 1986, Liverpool came to Ireland and they played a friendly game in Cork, which is a city in the south of the Republic. Jack Charlton met Kenny Dalglish after that game, and Jack Charlton put it to him about the Liverpool players withdrawing their services for the May 1986 tournament in Iceland. And apparently Kenny Dalglish said to Jack Charlton that if Jack Charlton dropped any of the Liverpool players as a result of that, Kenny would make sure that none of the Irish players would be made available for international selection in the future. So I suppose Jack Charlton really had no desire for a confrontation with club managers, and certainly not a manager, I suppose, of the stature of Kenny Dalglish. But unfortunately, going back to David O'Leary for a second, David O'Leary, for instance, he had no club manager to speak in his behalf. So in many ways, that was the culmination of all that, was that David was exiled for 2.5 years.
Let's kick off the season. On September 10th, 1986, the Republic of Ireland traveled to Brussels for the first Euro qualifier against Belgium, who had just finished fourth in the Mexico World Cup. For this match, we have the following lineup. The very first official match of Jackie Charlton. Paddy Bonner in goal from Celtic Glasgow. David Langan from Oxford. Mark Lawrenson from Liverpool. Chris Hughton from Tottenham. He replaced by Jim Beglin of Liverpool in the 81st minute. Kevin Moran of Manchester United, Ray Houghton of Oxford, Paul McGrath of Manchester United, Liam Brady at Ascoli in Italy, Tony Galvin of Tottenham. He replaced by Ronnie Whelan in the 79th minute, captain of the side Frank Stapleton of Manchester United, and John Aldridge of Oxford. And quickly going through the Belgium lineup, we have Jean-Marie Pfaff of Bayern Munich, Georges Groen of Anderlecht, Frankie van der Els of Club Brugge, Leo Kleisters of Mechelen, Patrick Verwoerd of Beerschot, Frank Verkouteren of Anderlecht, Stefan de Mol of Anderlecht, Enzo Schifo of Anderlecht, Nico Claesen of Tottenham, Philippe Desmet of Lille in France, captain of the side, Jan Sulemans of Club Brugge, and the team managed by Guy Thies.
First of all, this was Ireland's 225th match, 225th international match. The game was significant, as you pointed out, in that it was actually televised live in the Republic of Ireland on RTE, which is the Irish state broadcaster, and that was a major event in itself at the time because soccer internationals, the live international coverage of them tended to be somewhat few and far between, certainly in the 1980s anyway. And the fact maybe that it was an away game contributed to the decision to televise it live in Ireland. But just to run through the Irish team there, of course, Ray Houghton and John Aldridge, of course, this was their competitive debuts. Jack Charlton had called them up the previous March for his first ever game in charge, which was a friendly against Wales. But this was actually the Oxford players' competitive debuts. Chris Hewson, actually, as you said, he was substituting this game, and this was actually to be his last appearance for Ireland until the following April. It was also the first competitive international match at the Heysel Stadium since the 1985 European Cup final. So Ireland, anyway, they played a 4-4-2 formation. They got off to an unfortunate start in the 13th minute when Nico Klassen scored from a corner. But 4 minutes later, following a good passage of play, Frank Stapleton scored with a full-length diving header, which made the score 1-1. It remained that way until half-time. Midway through the second half then, Belgium got another corner and Enzo Schifo headed in. It was a header from 12 yards or something like that looped over Hack Bonner. And it looked as though it was going to be another case of so near and yet so far for the Republic. But in the very last minute, on a breakaway attack, Frank Stapleton was put through on goal. He was put through from a pass by Jim Backlin. Jean-Marie Pfaff, the Belgium goalkeeper, rather, I suppose, maybe whether it was a rush of blood to the head or not, I don't know. But whatever, anyway, he came out to the edge of his penalty area and took down Frank Stapleton. A penalty was awarded, and in fact, the last kick of the game, Liam Brady equalised from the penalty spot. So it was a point that was deserved on the overall run of play, because this was a game where Jack Charlton's new policy of play was evident in both Ireland's long ball play and the way in which Irish players, they kind of dallied or delayed in possession far less when they were not in possession. Liam Brady, for instance, he tended to speed up his deliveries a lot, and this was evident in this game. So that was indicative as well of the new style Jack Charlton was implementing. A few passes were wasted, and it was a typical battling performance by the Irish, but there was a degree of skill mixed in with that as well. And the irony was that, as we know, Liam Brady, of course, and Jack Charlton, they had differences of opinion in later years, which led to Liam Brady's ultimate, I suppose, dropping from the Republic of Ireland team a few years further on. But in this particular match, Jack Charlton praised Liam for his running and his all-round performance. And of course, the substitutes that were included, two of the Liverpool players were included for two of the Tottenham players, and both of them were introduced to give fresh legs down the right-hand side. And all things considered, it was the best away performance by the Irish international team in about a decade or so. And of course, it was redemption for Liam Brady as well, in that he scored the last-minute penalty, but on his previous visit to the Heysel Stadium 6 years earlier, he had missed a penalty for Arsenal in the 1980 European Cup Winners' Cup final penalty shootout against Valencia. So, as I say, in some ways it was redemption for him. And also a little bit of trivia about this game, Shahan. I'm not sure whether this was the first game, but it was certainly I don't recall this happening since, where the Republic of Ireland international team, they wore all green, as in green shorts, green shorts and green socks. So it was very much a case of green all over. Of course, we should also point out, of course, I mean, when you were going through the Belgium team earlier on, of course, it brought back some memories of that fine team that reached the semi-finals in Mexico of 1986. But what tended to be the way in those days, and still tends to be the way today, is that when a team performs well at a tournament, be it European Championships or World Cup, in their first match immediately after that tournament, usually the following fall, they tend to be somewhat vulnerable. It seems to take, a lot of teams a game or two to kind of get back up into the speed of things again. So perhaps maybe the Republic played Belgium at just the right time as well, in that Belgium were coming off the back, I should say, of a successful World Cup. And maybe in the first game immediately after that World Cup, maybe they were a little bit vulnerable. So it probably took Belgium a game or two, to get back up to the pitch of where they were at the World Cup. So in that sense, maybe the Republic played them at a good time. And of course, the fact that it was away from home as well meant it was a point very much gained rather than lost. And it was a fine start to the Ireland's qualification campaign.
I was also going to point out that later Frank Stapleton admitted that the penalty should not have been awarded. Maybe they got away with one.
Yeah, perhaps they did, because as I say, it was a bit needless from Jean-Marie Pfaff In other words, because when Frank Stapleton was going through, there was a defender going back with him. So Jean-Marie Pfaff, for instance, could have stayed in his line, or he need not have come out to the edge of the penalty area, but for some reason he did. Took down Frank Stapleton, penalty was awarded, and Liam Brady done the rest.
You touched on the relationship between Jack Charlton and Liam Brady earlier, John, and Charlton had asked him to play further upfield in this system rather than his usual deep lying role. Can you expand on that and how Liam Brady responded to the change of role?
Well, Paul, I mean, kind of first of all, it would have been, I suppose, in some ways, anathema to Liam, because, as I say, it was a different role Jack was asking him to perform, as opposed to the role that Liam usually had performed both at club and international level up to this. But Liam, in fairness to him, and even Jack said this after the Belgium game, Liam adapted well and he applied himself well and never stopped running. So I suppose in some ways, Jack's system, it was going to take time to bed in. I mean, success wasn't going to happen overnight with it. And I mean, players were going to have to, I suppose it was going to take players maybe a few games or maybe even the best part of a season, because international matches tended to be few and far enough between in those days. It was going to take maybe the best part of the season, for players to fully adapt to that type of system, because the system that they were playing under Jack was, as I say, alien to the system that many of them, if not all, would have played for their clubs. But as Kevin Moran said once in an interview after the Jack Charlton era had ended, he said, the system that Jack wanted us to play was strange to a lot of us. But he said, when you play it for a few games and you get results under it, and good results at that, you kind of start tending to believe that this is the way to go. And I mean, the draw against Belgium in Brussels was further proof of kind of the improvement in results, because Ireland had won the Icelandic tournament the previous May, and even though that was in many ways an inconsequential end of season tournament, it was the first tournament that the Republic actually won, so it instilled a bit of belief and a bit of confidence, and in some respects maybe a belief to an extent in the players that maybe Jack Charlton's system of playing football was indeed the way to go to achieve results at international level.
In fact, it's fair to say that in a previous incarnation, this Ireland team would have lost in Belgium. However, they scraped the last-minute equalizer. So was this the Charlton effect that everyone was talking about?
It was the beginning of it. Now, as I said earlier, success wasn't going to happen overnight, and there was going to be a few bumps on the way as well in the implementation of this system, which we will see in some of the games that we will discuss later on in this podcast. But in another respect as well, of course, you could say that Ireland were due a bit of luck against Belgium, because 5 years earlier in 1981, I mean, Ireland had been undone in Belgium thanks to what can only be described as a disgraceful refereeing decision, which cost Ireland a point in the 1981 game. And in actual fact, if Ireland had got that draw in 1981, they would have gone to the World Cup in 1982. So I suppose you could say it was a case very much of the book balancing itself out in that respect.
Ireland's next qualifier was on October 15th. At Dublin, at Lanson Road, they hosted Scotland. For this match, we have the following lineup: Paddy Bonner, David Langan, Jim Beglin, Mick McCarthy of Manchester City, Kevin Moran. He replaced by Jerry Daly of Shrewsbury Town in the 71st minute. This was Jerry Daly's final cap, his 48th and final cap. His first cap had been in 1973. Then you have Liam Brady, Paul McGrath, Ray Houghton, captaining the team Frank Stapleton, John Aldridge, and Kevin Sheedy of Everton. Quickly going through the Scotland lineup, you have Jim Leighton of Aberdeen, Ray Stewart of West Ham, David Narry of Dundee United, Richard Gough of Tottenham, Alan Hansen of Liverpool, Paul McStay of Celtic Glasgow, Gordon Strachan of Manchester United, captain of the team Roy Aitken of Celtic Glasgow, Mo Johnson of Celtic Glasgow, Graham Sharp of Everton, and Murdo MacLeod of Celtic Glasgow, the team managed by Andy Roxburgh. This match ended as a scoreless tie.
First of all, expectation had been raised among the Irish soccer public, in no small part due to the draw against Belgium in Brussels the previous month. The game was played in Lansdowne Road, and it was actually a 49,000 sellout, which was the first time in quite a long time, that a Republic of Ireland international soccer game had sold out in Lansdowne Road. The game, which was rare for a home game as well, it was also televised live on RTE. I actually remember kind of coming home from school as fast as I can, or as fast as I could, I should say, on that Wednesday afternoon, because it was a 3:30 kickoff and school finished at 3 o'clock in those days. So I remember walking home from school basically as quick as I could so that I would be in time for the game. It was a poor game. I suppose in some ways it was a return to bad habits, and it was a complete anticlimax from the performance the previous month against Belgium. Ireland's performance was poor and dull. They dominated possession, but there was little creativity there, and as a result, they created few chances. Now, the pitch, as you know, Lansdowne Road was and still is predominantly a rugby stadium or a rugby field. So in those days, the FAI were renting Lansdowne Road from the IRFU. So unfortunately, the IRFU, the Irish Rugby Football Union, were somewhat of the masters in that respect. And more often than not, the pitch tended to be in a poor state, because there were several instances in that era of, say, rugby games taking place in Lansdowne Road on a Saturday, and then the following Wednesday, you may have had an international soccer game taking place. And I mean, there was no underside heating in the ground. So particularly in wintertime, the pitch surface tended to be poor, and the grass then, because it was a rugby surface, the grass tended to be longer than usual. So the state of the Lansdowne Road pitch actually became a hot topic in later years as time went on. But for this game anyway, even Andy Roxburgh, the Scottish manager, he was quite critical of the surface. And indeed, several of the Scottish players were as well. And because of the surface being poor, a lot of high balls were played by both sides to try and combat the poor state of the pitch. Jack Charlton, I suppose, we kind of got a glimpse into his temperament post-match, in that at the post-match press conference, he walked out of it when one Irish journalist, he suggested that professional soccer players should know when to alter their tactics without actually having to be told when to do so. Because, as I said already, many players were playing a totally different system to what they played at their clubs. Now, the striking duo of Frank Sapin and John Aldridge, they missed glorious chances in this game. Aldridge, I think, on the hour mark should have been awarded a penalty. I think it's fair to say, but the Romanian referee did not give the penalty. So apart from that, it was a poor game, little to report on. Even my memories of watching the game, it was a dull performance. And I suppose it was best summed up by Jimmy Meegan, who was an Irish soccer journalist for the Irish Press newspaper, when the headline under his match report or over his match report the next day was in the Irish Press, bad pitch, bad football, and a bad result. In some ways, you see that undone the good work that was done in Belgium the previous month, in that Ireland had now dropped a point at home. It was a dull performance, and it kind of, I suppose, put Ireland on the back foot a little bit as regards qualification.
Yeah, you've given a hint as to how this result was regarded, but do you think it was always likely to be a hard-fought game against Scotland, a British-style game, a lot of players that already knew each other very well?
Yes, indeed, Paul. That's a good point. And Scotland as well, I think they seem to, kind of come just for a point, because they played three centre halves. So that naturally would indicate that they would have been happy with a point, because they had to get something out of this game as well. Because, I mean, they had started their campaign the previous month with something of a disappointing home draw against Bulgaria. So it was imperative for Scotland that they got something out of this game. But whereas a victory for Ireland in this game would have given Ireland a solid footing in the group, but it wasn't to be anyway. So kind of, I suppose, in many ways after the Scotland game, as regards qualification, the Republic were sort of back to where they were, having gained a point away against Belgium and then having dropped a point at home against Scotland. But going back anyway to the state of the Lansdowne Road pitch, and as I was saying, this became a hot topic in later years, because a number of visiting managers and visiting players complained about the poor quality of the surface. But as time went on and the Irish players became more attuned to Jack Charlton's system, Jack Charlton actually encouraged the groundsmen at Lansdowne Road to make sure that the grass remained long, because that tended to stifle particularly a lot of continental teams and, you know, kind of I suppose a lot of skillful players that would have been skillful on the ground and so on. So that would have, I suppose, stifled them. And then the fact that the Republic were traditionally kind of a long ball team and strong in the air, and kind of they tended, because they were strong in the air, kind of the majority of their play would have been kind of in the air anyway. So maybe having a poor surface, you know, would have stifled the opposition, and it would have helped the Republic's long ball and high ball tactics to an extent. We should bear in mind as well, of course, that all internationals that were played in Lansdowne Road in those days, indeed up to 1993 or so, were played midweek and in the afternoons, because Lansdowne Road did not have a floodlighting system. So that would have explained kind of the reason why all these matches took place in daylight.
We mentioned earlier that this match against Scotland also marked the last international match of Jerry Daly, 48 appearances since 1973. Can you discuss his career in green colours?
Yeah, well, he had a reasonably successful career, I suppose, in the Irish colours. Kind of, he was really kind of, he played during an era where Ireland didn't have success, but came close on a couple of occasions for qualifying. But I mean, he was a good, solid player. He was a reliable penalty taker. From a midfield player, he chipped in with his a few goals over the years. But I suppose in one way, Jerry was kind of past his best at this stage. He was with Shrewsbury, I believe, at this time, and he was, I suppose, slowly coming to the end of his career. And it was, of course, another instance of Jack, for various reasons, dispensing with the old guard, as it were, kind of the players that would have been mainstays under John Giles and under Owen Hand, because as we've seen, kind of when Jack Charlton took over, he immediately attempted to discard a few of the mainstays under Owen Hand, players such as Jim McDonough, Tony Grealish, Michael Robinson, and of course Jerry Daly now as well. So in many ways it was kind of out with the old and in with the new, and something of a changing of the guard.
For its final match of the calendar year, on November 12, 1986, Ireland had a friendly at Varsa against Poland. For this match, we have the following lineup: Paddy Bonner in goal, David Langan, Jim Beglin. This was his 15th and final cap. His first cap had been in 1984. Mick McCarthy, Kevin Martin. Captaining this time, Liam Brady, Paul McGrath, Ray Houghton, Frank Stapleton, John Aldridge, and Kevin Sheedy. This match, Poland won 1-0, Marek Koniarek scoring in the 43rd minute.
Well, first of all, Shahan, just to point out a couple of things. Liam Brady, as you said, was captain. And I think this was probably due to the fact that this was actually his 60th international appearance. And at that stage, he had equalled John Giles' record of having the most Irish caps. So I think it was because of that Liam was a captain for this game. Strangely enough, and I suppose this was it wouldn't happen today in international level, it's fair to say, Ireland actually introduced no substitutes. The starting 11 were the 11 that finished the game. So apparently there was only 8,000 hardy souls present in Poland. There was no match footage of the game available because the game was not televised in any shape or form in Ireland. And even looking at YouTube highlights of the game tend to be quite scant. In many ways, it's really kind of impossible to assess the performance on the night, except just go on a couple of newspaper reports that are available. But according to the couple of newspaper reports to hand, this performance against Poland was in many ways a repeat of the performance against Scotland. And in some respects, maybe it was perhaps worse. And by all accounts, Ireland were lucky to lose by just one goal. It seems played a mixture of the long ball and a patient build-up. And as a result of this, Ireland had a lot of possession, but they tended to be vulnerable on the counter-attack. Frank Stapleton apparently missed a good chance late on, but in the overall scheme of things, a draw would have been an unfair result, because by all accounts, Poland were the better team and deserved to win on the night. But as I say, kind of with the absence of match footage, it's kind of impossible to say too much else about it. except that Jack Charlton did acknowledge after the game that there was still an awful lot of work to be done with the team and an awful lot of work to be done before their next game the following February against Scotland in Glasgow. Now, I should point out as well, just as an aside before we go any further, that up to this time, you see, the FAI was still kind of a bit amateurish in their approach. And some officials as well in charge of the FAI were I suppose, amateurish as well, and some of them wanted to kind of put their own stamp on proceedings, because Jack Charlton actually told a story in later years that in his early days as manager of the Republic of Ireland, when he would draw up a squad of players for an upcoming international game, he would submit the list of players to the FAI treasurer, who was a Peadar O'Driscoll. And Peadar O'Driscoll then, Jack entrusted Peadar O'Driscoll with taking the list of players to the FAI administrative offices in Dublin and contacting the clubs and making sure the players were called up. But after a couple of games anyway, Jack noticed that anytime he named a squad, there always seemed to be 2 or 3 extra players arriving, the pre-match get-together, or, arriving for pre-match training. And Jack was wondering why this was happening, but it emerged after a while that, in actual fact, Peadar O'Driscoll, he was taking the list from Jack Charlton. Peadar, before submitting it to the FAI offices, Peadar would look at the list himself, and if there was 1 or 2 or maybe even 3 players that Peadar himself liked, but that Jack hadn't included, Peadar would add those to the list. So there was a bit of that going on. So when it eventually emerged anyway what was happening, from then on, Jack took the policy of personally delivering his list to the FAI offices in Dublin. And actually, it was said as well, he would actually remain in the office until all contact had been made with the clubs of the players. So there was a little bit of that going on as well. So, yeah. I think it was, in some respects, it was kind of Peadar taking advantage of the fact that Jack was still familiarising himself with the players and familiarising himself with the way things were done in Ireland.
Although this game itself isn't so memorable, and as you say, there's no footage. Was there any sign there maybe that Jack Charlton was unhappy that his system wasn't quite working? This was a couple of games without a goal after this game.
Yeah. Well, he said after the game to one of the newspaper reporters that it was a game that nothing went right. Now, maybe it was maybe the fact that he introduced no substitutes. Maybe he wanted to kind of roadmap his system once and for all in this particular game, perhaps. But as I say, in the absence of footage, it's kind of impossible to be definitive about the performance. But it was obvious as well at that stage that maybe the optimism of previous months kind of had been slowly, I suppose, punctured, kind of both in the performance against Scotland and this performance against Poland. So there was still an awful lot of work to be done with the team. And I suppose the forthcoming results, I suppose, in the spring of 87 would be proof of whether the Jack system was actually a success or not.
This was also the last match for Jim Beglin.
Yes.
Can you discuss the injury that ended his career? And do you think that he would have been an integral part of Charlton's plans into the 90s?
Hard to say. Now, I believe kind of for this 86-87 season anyway, he would have remained an integral part because he was an attacking player. He was good at getting up and down the field. So kind of whether Jack Charlton would have seen him as too creative for Jack's own liking or not, I suppose we'll never know at this stage. But of course, unfortunately, of course, nobody knew this at the time, but as you pointed out, Shahan, this was to be Jim's last international appearance because unfortunately he suffered a horrific leg injury in January of 1987 in a League Cup game against Everton. Alan Hansen, actually, who played that night in the same game, described the tackle. I think it was made by
Gary Stevens.
Gary Stevens, yes. Alan Hansen described the tackle as a mile high and an hour late. It was a very serious injury. Put Jim Beglin out of action for some time. He did recover, and he did have something of a fleeting career at Leeds United, but he was never really the same player after that. So, I mean, this was the end of Jim's international career. And he was a loss because kind of in the matches that he played for Ireland, in almost all of them, he acquitted himself quite well. And he would have been a useful addition to Jack Charlton's squad going forward, but it wasn't to be anyway. And really, that was that.
Now we come to the new calendar year 1987. On February 18, 1987, Scotland hosted a Republic of Ireland at Hampden Park at Glasgow for the return fixture. For this match, we have the following lineup: Paddy Bonner, Paul McGrath, Mick McCarthy, Kevin Moran, Ronnie Whelan, Ray Houghton, Mark Lawrenson, Liam Brady. He'd be replaced by John Byrne of Queen's Park Rangers in the 60th minute. Tony Galvin, captain of the side, Frank Stapleton, and John Aldridge, who at this point had joined Liverpool. Quickly going through the Scotland lineup, we have Jim Leighton of Aberdeen, Ray Stewart of West Ham, Maurice Malpas of Dundee United. He replaced by Ollie McCoist of Rangers Glasgow in the 67th minute. Richard Gough of Tottenham, Alan Hansen of Liverpool. Captaining the team, Roy Aitken of Celtic Glasgow, Pat Nevin of Chelsea, Brian McClare of Celtic Glasgow, Mo Johnson of Celtic Glasgow, Gordon Strachan of Manchester United, Davy Cooper of Rangers Glasgow, and he'd be replaced by Paul McStay of Celtic Glasgow in the 46th minute. Side managed by Andy Roxburgh. Ireland would come away with a key 1-0 win.
First of all, the game was actually televised live in Ireland, which was, again, a big thing as well. I think down to the fact that it was an away game. And of course, there was a healthy Irish contingent among the support in Hampden Park that night, because Glasgow would be a short hop from places like Dublin and so on. So there was a good number of Irish supporters present. For once, actually, Ireland seemed to have turned the corner in that it was a marvellous Irish performance. And I think kind of all the journalists and media in Ireland were acknowledged that in the aftermath of this game. Mark Lanson and Ray Houghton gave magnificent performances, and the centre-half partnership of Mick McCarthy and Kevin Moran performed extremely well. Ronnie Whelan was outstanding, and what was more notable about Ronnie Whelan's performance was that he was playing in an unfamiliar position, to him anyway, of left back. In actual fact, the back four of the Republic of Ireland that night made for interesting reason, because you had Paul McGrath playing right back, you had Mick McCarthy and Kevin Moran in the centre, and then you had Ronnie Whelan playing left back. So it was really something of, certainly on the flanks anyway, it was something of an experimental setup, but it worked a treat, and the gamble that Jack took worked out brilliantly as it emerged. And this performance, it quietened many of Jack Charlton's critics at this stage. Now, the goal anyway came after 6 minutes. It resulted from a free kick awarded to Ireland. Scotland was somewhat aggrieved in that the referee allowed the free kick to be taken quite quickly. And indeed, even if you do look back at footage of this game, I think one would have to admit that the free kick was taken quite quickly. It was actually the quickest free kick I recall, I think I've ever seen taken. But the referee allowed anyway play to go on. And from that anyway, Mark Johnson had moved into an advanced position, and he scored. Now, that goal for Mark Lanson, that was his first goal for Ireland since November 1983 against Malta. So it was his first goal in over 3 years. And John Byrne of Queen's Park Rangers, who came on as a substitute for Liam Brady on the hour mark. This was John Byrne's first appearance since the previous April. This, you could say, was his first competitive game under Jack Charlton as well, or his first competitive appearance. But yeah, all round anyway, it was a magnificent result. I suppose to sum up, you could say Scotland were somewhat poor. In actual fact, Scotland, if I can just talk about them for a moment, they made something of a sluggish start to this qualification campaign. And it was unfortunate, really, because as things turned out, Scotland finished the qualification campaign extremely well. So maybe if Scotland hadn't made such a sluggish start to this campaign, Scotland may well have been in the shake-up for qualifying for the Euros come the end of the campaign. But as I say, it was a great Irish performance. It was a feather in the cap for Jack Charlton, and really a shot in the arm as regards vindication of his tactics and his style of football that he was implementing on the Irish team. And because of the fact that, of course, it was 2 points for a win in those days, but because of the fact we had actually won in Glasgow, in many ways, it compensated you for dropping the point against Scotland in Dublin the previous October. So Ireland were very much back on track at this stage as regards qualification. They had 4 points from 3 games. And even though it was still early in the qualification campaign, Ireland were in a promising qualifying position.
This was a crucial win in the qualifying campaign.
Absolutely. And I think as well, Paul, this was kind of maybe the first sign as well, maybe kind of the new Republic of Ireland under Jack, kind of in that kind of people, okay, the performance against Belgium was good, but then the subsequent performances against Scotland and Poland were poor. But maybe this performance against Scotland gave added belief among a lot of the Irish soccer public. In many ways, it made people sit up and take note. The signs were promising that something finally might be starting to happen at international level for the Republic. So in that respect, it was a crucial result. And I suppose in many ways, it could have been a season-defining performance for Jack as manager, because if Ireland had not won this game, it's open to conjecture as to what way the rest of the qualification campaign would have panned out, because in order to be in with a chance of qualifying, Ireland had to win this game because of the fact that they dropped a point in Dublin against Scotland. But Ireland managed to do that anyway, and their qualification was very much back on track. And I suppose the overall performance, just to sum up, was a vindication in this instance anyway of Jack Charlton's style of play.
You mentioned that the many injuries had forced Charlton to reshuffle the defense.
Yeah.
Especially.
Yes.
Now, did these changes alter his tactical outlook for the future, or was it a match-by-match necessity?
It tended to be something of a match-by-match necessity, I feel anyway, because kind of, as I said earlier, for instance, at centre-back, it was a department where we had an abundance of witches, and so much so that Paul McGrath was even deployed as a midfielder in those days, and Paul McGrath was to continue to be deployed as a midfielder well into the early 1990s. So it was very much, I suppose, in this particular game anyway, it was very much a case, I suppose, of cutting the cloth to suit the measure, as it were. And as I say, kind of the injuries didn't help, but either by accident or design, Jack stumbled on a formation that produced a winning performance. And I suppose at the end of the day, back then it was like today, it's a results-driven business, and a win, and particularly a win away from home against a reasonably high-ranking international team like Scotland was a welcome feather in the cap.
Yeah, there was a strange event in this game when Alan Hansen kicked the ball into touch.
There was,
seeing that his teammates were all marked. Was this another testament to Jack Charlton's tactics?
It was, yes, it was. And actually, that's a good point you made, because in that particular instance, Alan Hansen was in possession. He looked up, and there was no Scottish player free because the Irish were doing a tight man-to-man marking job. So Alan had no option, I suppose, but to put the ball into the stand. But as a side note anyway, now whether this was down to this or not, I don't know, but this actually was Alan Hansen's last international for Scotland. And it was also actually Ray Stewart's last international for Scotland as well. So whether it was down to maybe their performances in this game or not, I'm not too sure. But that's another interesting sideline to this particular game.
Ireland's next qualifier was again an away trip. On April 1st, they traveled to Sofia to face Bulgaria, who you mentioned had also played in the last World Cup. For this match that was played under a windy and rainy condition, we have the following lineup: Paddy Bonner, John Anderson of Newcastle, Mick McCarthy, Kevin Marne, Chris Houghton, Ronnie Whelan, Paul McGrath, Liam Brady, who had joined West Ham at this point, Tony Galvin, captain beside Frank Stapleton, and he was replaced by Niall Quinn of Arsenal in the 84th minute, and John Aldridge, who we mentioned had joined Liverpool in the new year. This match, Ireland would lose 2-1.
Well, first of all, I think the star performer in this game anyway was the referee, Carlos Valente from Portugal, because I remember actually this game was televised live in Ireland. It was an afternoon kickoff in Ireland. I think it was around 4 o'clock or so. And one of the headlines in the Irish newspapers the following day was that, "Senior Valente, you are an April Fool's joke." because of the fact the 1st of April being April Fool's Day. But the referee, Carlos Valente of Portugal, anyway, he was extremely poor, I think it's fair to say. And he did give a number of, I suppose, questionable, what you would call hometown decisions in this particular game. And so much so, actually, that Charlton admitted afterwards that at the post-match press conference, Jack had to bite his tongue when discussing the performance of the referee, and that was and biting his tongue was something that Jack found, as you know, very hard to do. But as I say, it was poor refereeing performance, and I suppose in many ways it echoed a similar poor performance from a Greek referee 10 years earlier in 1977 in Sofia in a World Cup qualifier, which Ireland also lost. And of course, as I mentioned in the previous podcast, of course, the well-remembered performance of the referee in the 81 game against Belgium in Brussels, Fernando Nazares of Portugal. So, yeah, Carlos Valente, again a Portuguese referee, he certainly didn't endear himself to the Irish. And in many ways, this defeat could have gone a long way ultimately towards scuppering Irish chances of qualifying for the Euros. Just to sort of sum up the game, the first Bulgarian goal anyway was scored a couple of minutes before half-time. And in the build-up to this goal anyway, Mick McCarthy was clearly held. So, I mean, a foul could have been given against the Bulgarians in that instance. And so it was 1-0 at half-time. 6 minutes into the second half, then Frank Stapleton equalised, following a good build-up from the Irish. But then, with 8 minutes to go, Tanev, one of the Bulgarian attacking players, he was through on goal on a breakaway. Kevin Moran tracked him back. Kevin Moran fouled him outside the penalty area. And indeed, television replays, and indeed, one of the Irish journalists, when he inspected the pitch after the game, he could clearly attest to the fact that the foul took place just outside the area. But for some reason, Carlos Valente awarded a penalty, which Tanev himself scored. Now, Liam Brady and Frank Stapleton were outstanding in this game. And it turned out anyway that by this stage, Liam and Frank were the veterans of the team. So I'm not sure what that says about the performance, in that the two outstanding players on the Irish team were the veterans of the team. But John Anderson, he was actually recalled for this game. This was his first cap since May of 1986, actually the Icelandic tournament. And he played quite well in defence. He was another defensive option, of course, that Jack Charlton had at the time. Frank Stapleton could well have had a penalty after 20 minutes of this game. The match was played in a continuous downpour. Bulgaria's home record, as an aside, at this time was 4 defeats in 45 years. So it echoes back to what John Giles said about the 1977 game between Bulgaria and Ireland in Sofia, where John was player-manager and Ireland had lost that game quite contentiously as well. John summed it up when he said that Bulgaria in those days had an unbelievably good home record. So I think that was still very much the case here in 1987. That Eastern European teams and teams such as Bulgaria, whether it was due to refereeing, hometown decisions or whatever, they tended to have unbelievably good home records. So this result anyway kind of threatened to scupper Irish chances of qualifying, because in many ways it had undone a lot of the good work that had been achieved, particularly in the win over Scotland. And point out of this game, I think, would have been a fair result and would have left the Republic still in promising position. But it wasn't to be anyway. And as I say, the match being played in a continuous downpour didn't help the game as a spectacle either, because I even remember watching this game as an 11-year-old at home, and, you know, kind of the pictures coming from Sofia, you know, they were grey and they were dreary and they were damp. So you could even see from the television kind of that the match was played in inclement conditions. But Bulgaria won the game anyway, and that catapulted Bulgaria back into qualifying for the Euros, where it wasn't a hammer blow, but it was a severe blow, or it was a severe dent to Ireland's chances of qualifying. Now, of course, the Bulgarian team that day, of course, they featured 2 players that were to come to prominence at the 94 World Cup. The goalkeeper, Borislav Mihailov, and of course, Nasko Sirakov. They both played for Bulgaria that day. Christos Stoichkov didn't play in this game now, whether his international career had actually begun at this stage or not. I'm not too sure.
He was suspended.
Yeah.
Christos Stoichkov was suspended in 1985 after CSK Sofia and Levski Spartak Sofia in the Bulgarian Cup final. There was a brawl. Many players, including Stoichkov, were suspended for a number of years. So I think Stoichkov was only eligible in the fall of 1987, and that's when he made his international debut.
Oh, I see, yeah, because he suddenly played in the return match against Ireland in Dublin the following October. So, that's an interesting bit of info. So, so as I say, Mikhailov anyway and Sirakov, who came to prominence in the 94 World Cup, they played for Bulgaria in this game in 1987.
I guess we should point out that Bulgaria's first goal was scored by Anio Satkov in the 31st minute. After as you mentioned, he had pushed McCarthy to gain possession.
Yes. Although it was somewhat ironic, because Mick McCarthy as a player kind of was well known kind of for the petty fouls as well. And actually, Mick had a remarkable record, I think, over the years, of kind of getting away with these things unpunished, or not punished maybe as much as he should have been, because actually just a quick stat about Mick McCarthy. I read somewhere in the aftermath of the 1990 World Cup, for instance, that in the 1990 World Cup, I think Mick McCarthy committed more fouls than any other player in that tournament. He committed 23 fouls, but never picked up as much as a yellow card. So maybe he was a master of the dark arts. I'm not too sure. There you go.
After the key win in Scotland, this loss in Bulgaria was really Ireland's only real setback.
Yes.
Was there a feeling in the press that Ireland's chances for qualifications were dashed against a team that had qualified for the last World Cup?
Very much so. That would have been the prevailing feeling among the Irish media at the time. And indeed, a lot of the knowledgeable Irish soccer public as well, because as we all know, it was only one team to qualify. Now, it was 2 points for a win in those days. So maybe one defeat might not have been as damaging as one defeat would have been in the 3 points for a win era. But it certainly was a setback, and it made qualifying extremely difficult, because what it all meant was that the Republic could ill afford to drop any points in the remaining 4 matches in the qualification campaign. Now, as it turned out, the remaining 4 matches were somewhat favourable in that they had to play Luxembourg, both home and away. They had Bulgaria at home, and they also in the next match were going to have Belgium at home. So there was a chance that the Republic would achieve maximum points from those 4 games, and in that sense, put themselves in with a realistic chance of qualification. But Belgium, for one anyway, were not going to be easily overcome. And as it turned out, we were to see that quite evidently in the following game, which was played 4 weeks later on the 29th of April in Dublin.
That match at Lanson Road, return fixture against Belgium, we have the following lineup: Paddy Bonner, John Anderson, Ronnie Whelan, Mick McCarthy, Kevin Moran, Liam Brady. He's replaced by John Byrne in the 77th minute, Paul McGrath, Ray Houghton, captain of the side Frank Stapleton, John Aldridge, and Tony Galvin. For Belgium, managed by Guy Thys, we have the following lineup: Jean-Marc Pfaff of Bayern Munich, Eric Gerrits of PSV Eindhoven of Holland, George Groen of Anderlecht, Leo Kleisters of Mechelen, Patrick Verwoerd of Beerschot, Frank Verkouteren of Anderlecht, Philippe Albert of Charleroi. He'll be replaced by Pierre Janssen of Anderlecht in the 65th minute.
This was actually Philippe Albert's debut, I believe, Shahan.
Yes, it was. Yes,
and he actually, of course, as we all know, he came to prominence kind of in the Premier League in later years with Newcastle United.
So then we have Nico Claesen, Philippe Desmet of Lille, Enzo Schifo of Anderlecht, and captain of the team Jan Sulemans of Club Brugge. This ended as a scoreless tie.
First of all, of course, Belgium, because of the fact that they had been World Cup semi-finalists the previous year, and also because of the fact that Ireland had achieved a noteworthy draw in Brussels the previous September. This game was played in Lansdowne Road. It was again a 49,000 sellout. The Irish soccer public was still kind of responding positively to the performances of the Irish international team up to this point. For some strange reason, and I've never been able to find out why, the game was not televised live in Ireland, even though the game was a sellout. There was highlights shown that night on Irish television. But as I say, it was disappointing that the game was not televised live. But by all accounts, anyway, again, it was a disappointing Irish performance. Belgium were, fair to say, supremely efficient, and they nullified the Irish in a scrappy and somewhat disappointing game. And as a result of this disappointing home draw, Ireland's qualification aspirations had suddenly taken a nosedive, because Ireland now had to win their 3 remaining matches, and they, in addition to that, they had to hope that other results went their way as well. Liam Brady missed a sitter, apparently after 90 seconds, and Aldridge could have had a penalty after 6 minutes. But Belgium, I think it's fair to say, they came to Dublin with the intention of gaining a draw or gaining a point. And because of that, for most of the match, they tended to play a containment game, apart from a purple patch just before half-time when they put the Irish goal under a brief period of sustained pressure. Ronnie Whelan, once again, actually played at fullback in this game. And Belgium, as I say, they played a containment game. And a feature of their performance in this game as well was, and it did not endear themselves to much of the crowd, was playing long back passes to John Marie Pfaff, the goalkeeper. The irony was that as time went on, of course, Ireland's home record became fabled, and it became well known, I suppose, throughout the world in the soccer public, that Ireland, they were gaining an unbelievably good home record under Jack Charlton. But for this 86-87 season, whether it was the fact that it was taking time for Jack Charlton's philosophy to bear fruit, or whether it was the fact that players were still kind of slowly taking time to adjust to Jack Charlton's philosophy on football, Ireland's performances away from home tends to be better than their home performances for some reason. Because, I mean, this was another instance of dropping a point at home. We had dropped 2 home points at this stage. And in actual fact, in those home matches against Belgium and Scotland, we had failed to score. So, you see, kind of key to a successful qualification campaign was always, to have a very good home record. In other words, try and win all your home matches and pick up as many points as you possibly could away. But Ireland had already drawn 2 games at home, and coupled with the defeat in Bulgaria, it meant that Ireland's qualification hopes had really taken a nosedive. In actual fact, I think kind of after this game, I think it's as well to kind of just give a quick summation of the group standings at this stage. Belgium were on top. They had 7 points from 5 matches. Ireland were next. They had 5 points from 5 games. Of course, this was 2 points for a win. Bulgaria and Scotland were both on 4 points, but Bulgaria had only 3 matches played. So Bulgaria had 2 games in hand, both on ourselves and Belgium. And Luxembourg then were at the bottom, even though Luxembourg had only played 2 games. So it was looking bleak for Ireland at this stage, because in addition to Ireland having to win their 3 remaining matches, they also then had to hope that a particular sequence of results went their way as well. In other words, Belgium, to sum up, Belgium and Bulgaria in the fall of 87 would both have to lose to Scotland, and Bulgaria then would have to beat Belgium, and Ireland were going to have to, in turn, as well as beat Luxembourg home and away, they were also going to have to beat Bulgaria. But now, remarkably, this sequence of results did pan out ultimately, as it turned out. But at this stage anyway, things were not looking good. And even a lot of the Irish media had given up on Ireland having a realistic chance of qualifying for the Euros at this stage. Of course, Belgium, as we all know, there was still a formidable international outfit. Frankie Verkouteren that you mentioned, this was his 60th cap, which was more than itself. And just to go back to the Irish team for a moment, Mick McCarthy and Ronnie Whelan, both of these players actually won their 20th caps each in this particular game. And this was John Aldridge's 10th international appearance. So apart from that, anyway, just to quickly sum up, a disappointing game. Played once again on, I suppose, a relatively poor surface. Belgium came to Dublin with the intention of getting a point, and they succeeded in doing that. So, as I say, things were not looking good for the Republic of Ireland at this particular stage in the qualification process.
Next, on May 23rd, the Republic of Ireland hosted Brazil at Dublin at Lanson Road. For this match, we have the following lineup: Paddy Bonner, John Anderson, Captaining the team in Stapleton's absence, Mick McCarthy. At this point, he had joined Celtic Glasgow. He would be replaced by international debutant Ken Demange of Liverpool in the 64th minute. Kevin Moran, Ronnie Whelan, he'd be replaced by David Langan in the 60th minute. Liam O'Brien of Manchester United, he'd be replaced by Niall Quinn in the 80th minute. Paul McGrath, Liam Brady, Kevin O'Callaghan of Portsmouth. This was his 21st and final cap. His first cap had been 1981. John Byrne and John Aldridge. Going through the Brazil lineup, this was a young Brazil lineup with many players earning their first and second caps. So you have Carlos of Corinthians, Josimar of Botafogo, captaining the team, Geraldão of Cruzeiro, Ricardo Rocha of Guarani, Nelsinho of Sao Paulo, Douglas of Cruzeiro, Silas of Sao Paulo, international debutant Edu Manga of Palmeiras, but he'd be replaced by Rai of Botafogo, Ribeirão Preto in the 65th minute. Luis Müller of Sao Paulo, he'd be replaced by international debutant João Paulo of Guarani in the 74th minute. Mirandina of Palmeiras, he'd be replaced by international debutant the great Romário of Vasco da Gama in the 67th minute. And Valdo of Grêmio, side managed by Carlos Alberto Silva. Ireland would win this match 1-0, Liam Brady scoring in the 31st minute.
First of all, there's match highlights available on YouTube. The match was not televised live in Ireland because the match wasn't a sellout, even though Brazil were in town. It was a good performance all around by the footage that's available to us. Brazil were in the British Isles at the time because they were taking part in the Rouse Cup. And this would have been kind of, I suppose, maybe a bridging fixture between their games in the Rouse Cup against England and Scotland, because this game was played on Saturday, May 23rd. It was also the same day that England were playing Scotland in the Rouse Cup. So maybe because of that, the Ireland-Brazil game did not get a lot of coverage in the English press. But yeah, it was a notable win. As I say, match highlights are brief, so one can't give, I suppose, a thorough assessment of the Irish performance. But by all accounts anyway, it was a good performance. Brazil, I suppose, were, even though they had a few, as you say, up-and-coming players, of course, and they had a couple of established players in the mix there as well, they would have seen this game, I suppose, as a worthwhile, I suppose, walkout as well. So nonetheless, I mean, any day you beat Brazil is a good day. And this was Ireland's first ever victory over Brazil in 3 attempts. Of course, in 1974, Ireland had played Brazil in the Maracanã in a kind of a warm-up for the 1974 World Cup, a warm-up for Brazil, that is. And Ireland had unluckily lost that game 2-1. Actually, Terry Mancini of Arsenal actually had scored the Irish goal in that game. And then, of course, in 1982, of course, there was, from an Irish point of view, there was the infamous international where Ireland, a depleted Irish team, took on Brazil and they lost 7-0. And Liam Brady had played in this game. So I suppose it was something of a bittersweet experience for him. Thankfully, this next game 5 years later, it culminated in happy memories for him because, as you say, he scored the winning goal and he gave an all-round good performance. And of course, this was another sign that even though Jack Charlton's philosophy had its drawbacks, it was still capable at times of achieving respectable results.
Despite the fact that it was a young and inexperienced Brazilian team, it must have increased Charlton's credit with the fans. Can you describe the atmosphere around the result at the time?
Well, the atmosphere, was quite significant because, I mean, as I said a few moments ago, you're beating Brazil even today, no matter what sort of a team Brazil have available to them, is seen by teams like, say, Ireland and so on as being a significant result. Just to kind of quickly go through, of course, a couple of pointers about the Irish team that played that day, of course. Just see there. Yeah, Liam O'Brien, of course, this was his second cap, and he had something of a fleeting international career as well. Of course, another of the old guard from the Owen Hand era played his last game for Ireland in this encounter as well, Kevin O'Callaghan. Ken Demange, of course, he was a Liverpool youth team player at the time. He made his debut as a substitute in this game for Mick McCarthy. Ken Demange only won one further international cap, which was in October of 1988 in a home friendly against Tunisia. So, as I say, he had something of a fleeting international career, and he subsequently, after leaving Liverpool, he subsequently played a lot of his career in the League of Ireland. As I say, it was a notable win. There was only 17,000 present at the game. So whether that was down to the fact that it was an in-the-season game, or maybe kind of confidence levels in the Irish and interest levels maybe had dissipated a little bit due to the previous display against Belgium, is unclear. And then, of course, as well, as I mentioned earlier, Brazil were also playing the Rouse Cup tournament at this stage. So this game against Ireland was sandwiched between their fixtures against England and Scotland. So the Brazilian manager may have seen this game against Ireland as an opportunity to give some fringe players a run, with a view to blooding them, for, I suppose, upcoming more testing international games. So, but nevertheless, I mean, it was a notable victory for the Republic. And as I say, it kind of revived some bit of confidence in the team, even though kind of the overriding view still at the time was that Ireland were in many ways gone a long way towards blowing their chances of qualifying for the Euros. But a victory over Brazil, as I say, is a victory over Brazil, and it was a notable achievement in itself.
5 days later, on May 28th, Ireland played its next qualifier and the last match of the season. They traveled to Luxembourg. For this match, we have the following lineup: Paddy Bonner, John Anderson. He'd be replaced by David Langan in the 52nd minute. Paul McGrath, Mick McCarthy, Kevin Martin. He'd be replaced by John Byrne in the 46th minute. Ray Houghton, Liam Brady, Ronnie Whelan, captain of the team Frank Stapleton, John Aldridge, and Tony Galvin. Ireland would come away with a 2-0 win, with Galvin scoring in the 44th minute and Whelan in the 64th minute.
Yes, indeed. Well, it was a not convincing victory over the part-timers of Luxembourg. The game was televised live in Ireland, I suppose partly down to the fact that it was an away international. There was only an attendance, I believe, of 4,000 present, and a sizable number of that would have been from Ireland. Ireland would have brought easily a couple of thousand supporters with him. As I say, it was an unconvincing victory. Liam Brady played quite well in this game, but for some reason, the front two of John Aldridge and Frank Stapleton, they made very little impact up front. In actual fact, it was a scrappy Ireland performance, and in the build-up to the first Irish goal, Luxembourg claimed that Aldridge had actually committed a foul. So you could say that maybe the first goal that Ireland scored was somewhat fortunately awarded. And if Ireland had not got that goal just before half-time, it could have made for a very uncomfortable second half, because as it turned out, I mean, it was an uncomfortable Irish performance in many respects, because the win never looked to be totally assured until midway through the second half, when Ronnie Whelan scored the second goal. Just before the first Irish goal, actually Luxembourg had missed a glorious opportunity of their own. Had Luxembourg taken that chance, I mean, it could have made for an uncomfortable evening for the Republic all round. And Ronnie Whelan's goal, of course, this was actually his first international goal. He scored 3 international goals in total in 53 appearances, but this was actually his first international goal. And the other thing about this game, Shahan, was that from then on, from this game onwards, Ireland only won one competitive away international in the following 4.5 years. So from May 1987 up until November 1991, Ireland only won one competitive game away from home, and that game actually was the game that sent them to the Italia 90 World Cup against Malta in November of 1989. So kind of at this stage, or from then on, it was becoming evident that the Charlton philosophy was to play for a draw away from home and back yourself to win your home games. But overall, anyway, as I say, once again, it was a disappointing performance. Little of note in it. And just to give a quick rundown of the table, after this game, even though Ireland had kept alive their chances, the chances were seen as somewhat slim at this stage, because after this game, Ireland were in third place in the group. They were on 7 points, but they were in third place because Bulgaria topped the group on 8 points. Belgium had 7. Ireland had 7. But Ireland had played a game more than both Bulgaria and Belgium. And then Scotland were back on 4 points, having played 5 games. And the significant thing as well was that, and this became evident in this game against Luxembourg and in the following game, in the return match in Dublin the following September, was the problem of goal scoring. Because, I mean, Belgium and Bulgaria, in their matches against Luxembourg in this qualifying campaign, I mean, they had put up a number of goals against Luxembourg. I think Belgium scored 6 when they visited Luxembourg, and Bulgaria had put 4 past Luxembourg as well. Whereas in 2 games against Luxembourg, we could only score a combined total of 4 goals. So because of that, Bulgaria and Belgium had better goal differences than us. So what all that meant was that if we were to qualify, we would have to finish above these teams on points. It was of no use, finishing level on points, and if you had a good goal difference to back that up. But because of the fact that our goal difference was poor and we weren't a goal scoring team, we would have to finish above these teams on points, which made qualification all the more difficult.
Now, as you mentioned, despite grinding out results, Ireland had trouble scoring goals. Let's remember at this point, John Aldridge still had not scored a goal for the national team. Clearly, it was a question of Charlton's tactics as opposed to Aldridge's ability. Can you expand more on this?
Yes. John Aldridge's role for the Republic was to kind of chase balls into corners of the field, kind of, and I suppose put pressure on the opposing centre halves or defenders or whatever. And because of that, you see, this role kind of took him away from, shall we say, the penalty box or the centre of the goal a lot. So in one way, that would have contributed to his low return of international goals. Although when he did finally break his duck in the autumn of 1988, the goals started coming fairly regularly for him after that. But as I say, maybe it was a case as well of John, having to adjust his style of play to the system that Jack wanted him to play. As I say, it wasn't conducive to him, being a fox in the box or anything like that. But I suppose Jack Charlton saw greater value in him, kind of chasing balls into the corners and maybe harassing and harrying defenders and maybe chasing down lost causes then to have him maybe in the penalty area all the time. So I suppose the jury is out on that one, as kind of whether Jack Charlton used John Aldridge or deployed John Aldridge to the best of his abilities or not. But be that as it may, anyway, that was the system that or that was the style of play that Jack wanted John Aldridge to perform when he was playing for Ireland, and John Aldridge done that. So naturally enough, it kind of impacted on his goal scoring rate quite considerably. But I suppose Jack saw John Aldridge kind of as making a fundamental contribution to the team, kind of chasing down lost causes and putting pressure on central defenders and so on, kind of when the defenders were building outplay from the back. As things turned out in hindsight, kind of in the autumn of 1987, the breaks finally began to go Ireland's way. They did pick up with results, and other results worked in their favour as well, which culminated in Ireland qualifying for the Euros. But of course, all that is for a future podcast.
As you said, at this point, I think most bookmakers would have had Bulgaria and Belgium as the favourites for this group. Was that the general feeling in Ireland as well? Very, very much so as well, because even the victory over Luxembourg, the newspaper coverage of that victory was quite scant in comparison to other international matches that Ireland would have played in that season. So, as I said before, a lot of the soccer journalists maybe had kind of conceded that Ireland were not going to qualify or were not in with a realistic chance of qualification for the Euros. But of course, as we saw, all that was to change quite spectacularly in the fall of 87. But for now, Ireland's chances were slim, and a lot of journalists and indeed some of the Irish soccer public, had resigned themselves to that fact. Now, of course, we should point out in passing as well that when Jack Charlton took over the Republic, he stated at the time that his main aim was to qualify for the 1990 World Cup. So in many ways, he could have been ultimately building towards the 1990 World Cup. And what he did say at the time was, if we happen to qualify for the Euros in 1988, it would be a bonus. So really, I suppose maybe in this qualification campaign, as I said already, it was taking time for Jack's, I suppose, philosophy
to kind of, I suppose, rub off on the players. And it was taking time for the players to adjust to a system of play that was quite different to the system they would have played for their clubs. But Jack was his aim anyway. He was building for the 1990 World Cup. So, I mean, he could argue as well that this was the ultimate target that he was building for, maybe, and for the Euros to get a solid qualification campaign behind them. Because it's fair to say that even if Ireland had not qualified for the Euros, their overall qualifying campaign, would have been reasonably solid enough up to this point. As I say, there is that way of looking at it as well. Yeah, so of course, I mean, Scotland were kind of floundering at this stage, but I mean, Scotland, as it turned out, kind of made a barnstorming finish to the qualification campaign to an extent. So if Scotland had not made such a poor start to this group, they could have well have been in contention for qualification as well.
In closing, at the end of this season, what was the view regarding the general state of the Ireland national team under Charlton and his future? Had he won over the press and the public at this point?
Very much kind of a mixed bag, Shahan, in that kind of there were performances that were good, and particularly the away performances against Belgium and Scotland. But that then was tempered by the disappointing home draws against the same opposition. And of course, the away performance against Bulgaria was a game that Ireland maybe could have got a point from as well, and a game that Ireland was somewhat unlucky to lose. But the overall, I think a lot of the Irish soccer public, was still unconvinced. Number one, by the results, in that kind of Ireland tended to follow a good performance or a good result with a poor result. And then you see the style of football, as I said, that Jack espoused. It was not pretty on the eye, and it was not appealing to a lot of supporters. So, I mean, the reaction was somewhat mixed. But I think at this stage, kind of the general perception was they were going to kind of hope that Ireland could win their two internationals in the fall and finish the qualifying campaign on a strong note, and gain a bit and really give the 1990 World Cup qualification campaign a rattle. Qualification for the World Cup, as we all know, was going to be easier in that you had two teams qualifying from groups. A haul of 11 or 12 points from 8 games would be enough to qualify you for a World Cup, whereas might not be the case for the Euros when you had only one team qualifying. But such was the way anyway. So to sum up anyway, the overall, I suppose, view of Jack Charlton's first full season in charge was somewhat mixed. But it was obvious as well kind of that he still had some way to go to win over much of the Irish soccer public and get the public on his side. Now, as it turned out, in the next podcast we will do, results spectacularly fell into place. And of course, that culminated kind of in a performance at the Euro 88 finals in Germany. But for now, anyway, the reaction was still a little bit mixed, and people were just kind of, I suppose, waiting to see, how the remaining games in the Euro qualification would pan out, and then maybe make an assessment on his time in charge up to that point. Because one other thing as well, you see, around this time as well, and this is and this actually is not a well-known fact. In the autumn of '87, Owen Hand, who was the former manager, he actually said in his autobiography that he was informally sounded out about the possibility of taking over as Ireland manager again if Ireland were to fail to qualify for the Euros. Because it seems as well kind of off the record that even some of the upper echelons in the FAI, were unconvinced by the performances up to this point under Jack. And if Ireland had not qualified for Euro 88, of course, whether the FAI would have retained Jack in the role or not is unclear. But certainly, it would have put doubt into a lot of decision makers' heads in the FAI as to whether Jack was the right person for the role or not. So that's anyway an interesting aside. But as I say, it's all ifs, buts, and maybes anyway, with the benefit of hindsight.
With that, once again, we would like to thank Mr. Carroll for his participation in this series. As always, feel free to leave questions and comments. You may contact me on my blog and on Facebook under Soccer Nostalgia. On Twitter, I'm at SP1873. Mr. Paul Whittle can be contacted on his blog, The 1888 Letter, and on Twitter, he is at 1888 Letter. You may also follow the podcast on Spotify and now on Google, Apple, and Stitcher, all under Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. Please leave a review, rate, and subscribe if you like the podcast. Mr. O'Carroll's contact info has been included on the blog and podcast uploads. And all this information is always on the blog and podcast uploads. So, John, thank you once more, and looking forward to the next one.
Indeed, and a big thank you once again to you, Shahan, and of course to Paul. And long may you continue with the podcasts.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
They have certainly got me through many a Monday afternoon anyway in the past. So looking forward to hearing hopefully many more of them.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. We look forward to continuing this series as well.